This is a presentation for the Winnipeg Philatelic Society, Western Canada's oldest stamp club, and it's called Let's Collect the Australian Antarctic Territory. And there is the first Australian Antarctic Territory stamp issued in 1957, map of Australia, map of the Australian Antarctic Territory, and a little picture of what it might look like in Australia, cold and snow, people in snowsuits. Now, it's a nice country to collect. It's interesting and scenic. There are not that many stamps, only 200 or so. And the used are cheaper than the mint, which means that people actually used them. And here's another stamp. This was also from the first series. Again, a map, and again, some scenery of Antarctica, a sled, and some husky sled dogs. Now, why do we collect a particular country or area? And there's several reasons, I think, lots of reasons, as many reasons as you want, actually, but you want to learn about some history. That can be one reason to collect stamps. Learn about a country. If the country's stamps are attractive or affordable, or if there are many topics that you can collect from that country. And I think the Australian Antarctic Territory touches all of these and perhaps some more. Now, the catalog value is not high. I think the highest used stamp catalogs at less than $20. Many or most of the used stamps are less than $1. They're the sort of the standard 20, 30, 40 cent catalog value. Now, they were valid for postage in Australia, so that's why so many got used. If they'd only been used in the Australian Antarctic Territory, there wouldn't have been that many used. Here's another stamp from 1959, and again a map, and I think Australia was trying to use stamps to establish their claim to the Australian Antarctic Territory. If someone said, hey, you don't really own that, they would say, well, sure we do. Here's a stamp that says we do. So 2 and 3 stamp with some penguins. Now, this is what's called the first issue of Australian stamps, and you'll see the brown stamp is overprinted. The blue stamp is not. And the stamp is of David, Mawson, and Mackay, who were first at the pole. And you notice they went 1908 to 1909. That's because they would have left probably November and December, because November, December, January is summer in the southern hemisphere. In January in the northern hemisphere, when we're thinking snow and winter, our Australian friends are thinking going to the beach and surfing. But my question and my confusion was, which of these stamps came first? Because normally the overprinted stamp comes after, because something happened. And it's a trick question, because the overprinted stamp came out in 1959, and the non-overprinted stamp was from 1961. And this is again something I didn't know until I spent time doing this presentation, so I learned something. Here's another AAT stamp. Again, it's a map, again showing their claim, and they're loading a weasel, which is the vehicle. But the Mawson stamp and this one were printed as 4 pence and 7 pence, and then overprinted to 5 and 8. So, and I hadn't noticed that this stamp was overprinted. It's harder to note that it's overprinted than the Mawson stamp. Now, I sometimes wonder if our Australian friends are having fun with us, and here they have a guy with his shirt off in the middle of the summer measuring the thickness of ice. Don't think there are many times in the Australian Antarctic Territory that you get to take your shirt off, but never mind. Now, as I said, the first stamp was in 1957. By 1999, they were up to number 114. In the year 2000, they only issued 2 stamps, as opposed to some countries that issued like 2,000 stamps. And to date, they're up to around catalog number 200. So it's not a bad country to collect. You could conceivably collect all of the stamps of the Australian Antarctic Territory, particularly if you decide that you're going to stop in 2010 or something like that. And it means they've been issuing 4 stamps per year in the last 20 years. So that's a pretty reasonable number of stamps for a collector. And there are not too many souvenir sheets, not too many souvenirs that really aren't, in my opinion, as a stamp collector, collectible. And there are lots of topics you can collect in the Australian Antarctic Territory: history, people, boats, animals, birds, sceneries, activities, planes, and more. So I'll just show you some of the stamps in those categories. There are lots. And the first, and this is history and people, Sir Douglas Mawson, and there's the stamp for him. He was born in 1882 in Yorkshire and died in Australia in 1958. He came to Australia as an infant, and as we saw on that stamp earlier, he was in the first 3 to obtain the southern magnetic pole. And that stamp is based on a very classic picture of him. And you notice he's wearing a wool balaclava. They didn't have the fancy winter gear we now have when we venture out in the cold. His perhaps greatest claim to fame is the Far Eastern Party, which was from 1911 to 1914, and it was made up of Mawson, Ninnis, and Mertz. And they left Cape Denison on November the 10th, 1912, of course, the beginning of summer. By December the 12th, 1912, they had gone 480 kilometers across 2 glaciers, and they are now named the Ninnis and the Mertz glaciers, and we'll find out why that happens in a sec. Lieutenant Belgrave Ninnis was one of the members of the party. He was born in 1887, and spoiler alert, he died December the 12th, 1912. 480 kilometers out, he fell into a crevasse. They were walking in a line. I think Mawson was first, Mertz was second, and Ninnis was third, with the sled with most of the food, the tents, and the supplies. And they were wary of crevasses, so Mawson was going first, figuring that if there was a crevasse, he'd go in, but they'd be able to pull him out because he didn't have a lot of stuff with him. 6 sled dogs fell too. They went down more than 150 feet. They could see 150 feet down, but really couldn't see much. 150 feet is the height of a 15-story building. They didn't have more than 100 feet of rope, so they hung around for a while to see if they could do anything, but concluded that they could not, so they turned back. Dr. Xavier Mertz, he died on January the 8th, 1913. Again, spoiler alert. He had 2 doctorates. They had 10 days of food when they turned back, and they were 30 days. They were a month out. In 5.5 hours, they were back to a prior camp where they had stashed supplies. They had stashed the supplies 2 days earlier, and they decided to make time, and they got back really quick when they decided to go back. They eventually ran out of food. They had to kill and eat their dogs. And 2/3 of the way back, Mertz weakened and died on January the 8th. So Mawson had 100 miles to go. He didn't know how far he had to go. He wasn't exactly sure where he was. He fell through 3 crevasses. The first time he fell through, he got caught up by the rope to his sled, and with great difficulty he was able to climb out, so he made himself a rope ladder that he tied to his back. He fell through twice more, but with the rope ladder he was able to climb out. On January the 29th, he found a food cairn and a note which told him where he was, and that he was 21 miles from Aladdin's cave, where there was more food. On February the 8th, very ill, and he was very, very ill. He was in rather horrible shape. He arrived at Cape Denison, and he had been alone for 31 days. The boat to take him back to Australia had just left, so he didn't return to Australia for a year later, till November of 2013. He observed that if he had made the boat, and he missed it by hours, I think, he concluded that if he had made the boat, he would have died because he was so weak that he figured he couldn't have withstood the sea voyage. So he hung around for 10 months, got stronger, and returned to Australia, a huge national hero. There are probably 10 Australian Antarctic Territory stamps for Mawson. Hillary, Sir Edmund Hillary, said that his exploits were probably the greatest story of lone survival in polar exploration, and if you read all the details about it, it was really quite the thing. So I said there were stamps of people, and here we have Mawson again. Here's his centenary of his birth. He was born in 1882, so 1982 is the centenary of his birth. A stamp for James Cook, who circumnavigated Australia in 1772. Boats. You'll notice there's snow and or ice in the background of all of these. Penguins in the front of the Discovery. Animals, a killer whale. I thought my Australian friends were perhaps having fun with me, showing a sperm whale killing and eating a giant squid. So remember I said that you might learn some stuff, so I looked it up, and yes, apparently giant squid are the favorite food of sperm whales and are very tasty. And sperm whales, giant squid have learned to swim and live deeper and deeper and deeper to get away from sperm whales, and sperm whales have learned to dive deeper and deeper and deeper to get their favorite food, giant squid. And sperm whales will dive up to 2 miles deep to get a giant squid. So our Australian friends are not having us on. That really happens. And the stamp for the last huskies. Huskies were, of course, used extensively to pull sleds in the Antarctic, but all the countries that have pieces of the Antarctic agreed that non-native animals, anything non-native, would be removed other than people. And so this is part of a set of 4 stamps that commemorated the last huskies in Antarctica. They were taken home to Australia and adopted. Birds, I said, so here's a strip of 4 birds and 1 set of elephant seals. But there are lots and lots of stamps of birds and animals too. Scenery. Here is perhaps where our Australian friends are having some fun with us. But I like evening, late summer. A guy in a snowsuit and snow boots and snow pants and a toque walking across ice and snow. And actually, both learning about Mawson's journey and looking at these stamps and seeing just exactly how cold it is all the time in the Antarctic made me think about, like, I live in a winter climate, and I think we're pretty tough. And we did go out for a walk this year when it was minus 35 Celsius. You know, fancy new down jackets, snow pants, snow boots, toques, balaclavas, fancy gloves. We were out for half an hour. We were pretty cold when we came back. So one has to admire the people that tolerate Antarctica, where it gets much colder than that and you don't have the opportunity to come into a nice heated house. Most of the pictures of Antarctic scenery have ice or snow, so brash ice. Evening, early winter, which you got to kind of admit doesn't look a whole lot different from late summer. Snow and ice. Activities. Here we have apple field huts, outside and inside. And finally, planes. You've probably seen enough, so I'll only show you 1 plane. But that's a Ford Trimotor, Admiral Byrd, rather. So, in summary, it's an interesting and scenic country to collect. Not that many stamps, under 200. So, in the end, it's a nice country to collect. So, thanks for listening.